I dedicate this book to the bright hope of a closer alliance based on better mutual understanding between two mighty nations, to both of which I belong, the one by birth, the other, no less, by marriage. There are few people in England, probably, who have not read some book or article on Russia, and some aspects of the life of that country are well known to English people. Yet it is not too much to say that great ignorance prevails about Russia as a whole. The thing lacking is a knowledge of history, for history alone explains the present by the past, and offers the right vantage ground from which to view the great drama in action at this time. History alone will explain, for example, why Russia is so irresistibly drawn towards Constantinople, and why so much blood has been shed in vain attempts to gain possession of the latchkey to her own front door, which the Western powers have prevented her again and again from getting into her hands. The ancient story of Oleg the Wise hanging his shield on the gate of Byzantium in 911 is a symbol of Russia's policy. A knowledge of history will also enable the reader to understand the living bond which exists between Russians and Balkan Slavs, who are all members of the same race and of the same church, and how this bond has always reasserted itself when the weaker brothers had reason to call upon the stronger for help against Turkish Muslims. There are also other vital points which have to be explained before Russia's political position can be rightly understood. For the mighty Russian Empire has not been built in a day. From a small beginning and by a number of different processes, it has grown to its present dimensions. For centuries, it grew by immigration and colonization, and it is only since the 16th century that expansion has come by means of conquest. In the course of the 10.5 centuries of her existence, Russia's political center has shifted 3 times, from Kiev to Vladimir, from Vladimir to Moscow, and from Moscow to St. Petersburg. Each of these 4 names represents distinct phases of development and periods with very definite characteristics. This development has not been one of continuous growth. It was interrupted by a great calamity, the Mongol invasion, which darkened the 13th century and from which it has taken centuries to recover. Again, the Russian nation is not a homogeneous whole, a nation of one blood, nor are her peoples all on the same level of culture. Unless these facts are grasped and the causes underlying the complexity of Russian history come to be understood, there can be no exact comprehension or balanced judgment of her problems and difficulties, and the part she has to play among the nations. It is because the history of Russia's expansion in the past is terra incognita to the average Englishman that the present political conditions, bringing with them great expectations to Poles and Finns for the future, cannot be rightly appreciated. The object of this book is to supply, in some measure, information regarding certain historical and economic facts on matters which puzzle the man in the street, not merely to recount stories, however picturesque. The aim in 1,000 years of Russian history is to convey general impressions of the various stages passed through by Russia in the course of her evolution, and to give sketches of the lives of those of her rulers who have stamped their era with the mark of their personality. The title indicates the wide limits of time and fact which have to be brought within the necessary limits of the book. In chapters 22 and 26, I have given concise monographs of those countries which by annexation or conquest have become an integral part of the empire, but which cause political and administrative difficulties to the central government. The nursery rhyme about the old woman who lived in a shoe, etc., is an illustration of the Tsar's position. Only in this case, the children want their own shoes, while the little father prefers to keep them in his. People of all classes have so frequently asked me for facts and explanations about Russia that I have been enabled perhaps to realize the points on which knowledge is most needed. And I trust that the information offered to the public will help to disperse the mists of ignorance and prejudice which have too long enveloped the vast Russian Empire and its peoples, distorting the proportions of good and evil in its history. I cannot better express my hope of seeing closer and ever more friendly relations between the two great peoples, now so happily allied, than by quoting the reply of Captain Chancellor, the first Englishman who, in 1553, visited Russia when asked the object of his coming, that they were Englishmen sent into those coasts from the most excellent King Edward the Sixth, having from him in commandment certain things to deliver to their king, and seeking nothing else but his amity and friendship and traffic with his people, whereby they doubted not but that great commodity and profit would grow to the subjects of both kingdoms. The maps have been adapted from Freeman's Historical Geography to suit the text. They illustrate the gradual shifting of power from Kiev to Vladimir, from Vladimir to Moscow, and from Moscow to St. Petersburg, as well as Russia's territorial expansion in Europe. The stippling encircling certain parts designates territories which in early days have formed part of the original Russian land, and those countries which later on have been joined to the empire, yet without being absorbed into it, such as Poland and Finland. In case this book should find Russian as well as English readers, I may explain to the former that I have throughout employed the form of proper names, which is traditional in England, and as there is no universally accepted rule for spelling Russian names in English, I have transliterated them as simply as possible. I embrace this opportunity to express my very grateful thanks to those English friends who have so kindly helped me by reading my MS and printer's proof, and by tracing maps and illustrations. I should like also to express my indebtedness to a Russian friend for kindly showing me shortcuts to knowledge by guiding me to the right sources of information, and for verifying my facts. Sonia E. Howe, St. Luke's Vicarage, Finchley, 5th May, 1915. The ignorance of English people as regards Russia is no modern peculiarity, but now in the light of the present-day opportunities, it is less justifiable. It can hardly be expected of a nation like the English, which has always had free intercourse with the outer world, that it should realize the possibility and extent of such an isolation as Russia suffered from during the 13th to the 16th century while under the Tatar yoke. For a nation whose political development has been normal and continuous, it is difficult fully to appreciate the effects on Russia of such a calamity as the Mongol invasion, which completely cut her off from Western Europe. When in 1375 a map of Europe was made for the King of France, Kiev was not even marked. On it only Riga, Krakow, Lemberg, and the town of Bolgary on the Volga. The remainder was a blank on which was printed the one word, Russia, and this in spite of the fact that in very early days there had been frequent intercourse between that country and the northwest of Europe, for the great trade for the great trade route to Byzantium passed through southwestern Russia. When, however, in 1459 a map was made for Venice, the original of which is still in the archives of that town, Moscow appeared on it. So far as England was concerned, Russia was rediscovered in 1553 by the Mystery Company and Fellowship of Merchants and Adventurers for the discovery of unknown lands, which sent an expedition to the far north with the object of finding a northeastern route to China and India. 3 ships left London under the command of Sir Hugh Willoughby, but being unprovided with the necessaries for an Arctic expedition, the gallant explorers succumbed to frost, hunger, and disease on the inhospitable shores of Russia. Fortunately, the crew of the 3rd ship escaped these dangers, but instead of finding a passage to China, its captain, Richard Chancellor, accidentally discovered Russia. The friendly inhabitants of the place were 30 years later the town of Archangel. The friendly inhabitants of the place where 30 years later the town of Archangel was founded, informed the astonished Englishmen that the land was called Russia and that it was ruled over by the Grand Duke of Muscovy. True to the British instinct not to let a chance for commerce or colonization go by, the undaunted explorers went on to Moscow, which they described afterwards as equal in size to London, but they added that its wooden houses could not be compared with those of the English capital. The enterprising Englishmen did not lose an opportunity for entering into business relations with this newly discovered state. Captain Chancellor presented to the Tsar a document which, in the same vague manner as an English passport of today, recommended the travel to the kindly favor of foreign governments. From that date, 1553, began English trade and intercourse with Russia, about which many books were written. In 1558, Russia was visited by Jenkinson, the tourist par excellence of those days, who crossed Russia and entered Persia to find a new route to India. And who on his return journey was commissioned by the Tsar to convey a special message to Queen Elizabeth, that the Queen's Majesty and he might be to all their enemies joined as one, and that England and Russland might be in all manners as one. A century later, Milton's brief history of Moscovia and of other less-known countries lying eastward of Russia proved that even in his day, Russia was still an unknown country and quite outside the sphere of European interests. The European states simply did not trouble themselves about her. She was ignored or looked upon as alien and unattractive. She was considered hardly fit to participate in political transactions, and no power desired her as an ally. From neither a military nor a diplomatic point of view was there anything to gain. Russia was useful merely on account of her products, chiefly grain, or as a market for other nations' wares, or else as an overland route to China and India. Even Turkey was far better known than Russia, for she represented a perpetual menace to Europe, while Muscovy was only described in historical treatises or in grotesque anecdotes. Later on, she became of interest for the student of ethnography or of language. As late as the 17th century, a Russian diplomatic agent who was trying to get French doctors for Russia complained that France thought Russia to be at the other end of the world, with India as its next-door neighbor. What a prophetic vision! But on the other hand, Russia was equally ignorant about Western Europe. It was as if she lived behind the Great Wall of China, nor did she know any desire to come into vital touch with the rest of Europe. Cut off from the West, her face was turned to the East, and the great historical events which stirred, uplifted, or convulsed Europe were ignored by her. The Shah of Persia was a personage of importance to whom in the year 1663 presents worth 100,000 and even 200,000 rubles were sent. The Shah of Persia was a personage of importance to whom in the year 1663 presents worth 100,000 and even 200,000 rubles were sent. While the goodwill of the Emperor of Austria was not considered worth more than 1,000 rubles. The Oriental despotism, as personified in the Sultan and in the Shah of Persia, greatly impressed the Tsar, while Ivan the Terrible's estimate of Queen Elizabeth was very low when he wrote to her, "We had thought that thou wert a ruler, possessing great power, and that thou didst uphold the honor of thy position, but now we understand that in thy state other people rule independently of thee." And what class of people? Just common merchants. As to the King of Sweden, the Tsar wrote to him that as the heaven is high above the earth, so much higher am I than thou. Russia's uncompromising attitude of aloofness towards all things Western is amusingly illustrated by the opposition evinced by a Russian when, at the instigation of Holland, a postal service was introduced in 1663. He writes, "The foreigners have made a hole into our country, and through it they pry into all our concerns." Russia's uncompromising attitude of aloofness towards all things Western is amusingly illustrated by the opposition evinced by a Russian when, at the instigation of Holland, a postal service was introduced in 1663. He writes, "The foreigners have made a hole into our country, and through it they pry into all our concerns. The post may bring financial benefit to the Tsar, but for the country it is bad. Whatever happens to us, the foreigners know it at once. I suggest that this hole be quickly and securely closed up. Also that all travelers should be carefully examined on leaving the country, lest they should carry away important information." Her political isolation was very convenient to some of Russia's neighbors. It was to their interest to keep her on a low level of culture, and geographically, Poland, Lithuania, and the Baltic provinces formed a barrier between Russia and the other nations. Until 1686, no Russians were permitted to pass through Poland. Therefore, Archangel was the only outlet, which made foreign travel an arduous and dangerous task. To reach Italy, 7,000 miles had to be traversed. That is, a distance equal to that between Lisbon and the Great Wall of China. About the middle of the 16th century, however, the Tsar, Ivan IV, decided to bring into his country foreigners, professional men, mechanics, and artisans from Germany. But unfortunately, his scheme was frustrated and the men prevented from reaching his dominions. Some of the Western powers began to realize the dangers of a civilized Russia and put obstacles in the way of her procuring the necessary means for economic progress. The Emperor of Germany, Maximilian Maximilian the First wrote early in the 16th century to the Grand Master. The Grand Master of the Teutonic Knight, who ruled over Prussia. Russia's vastness is a danger to us. That Russia might really awake one day and take her place as a great power was deemed hardly possible. Yet there lurked an uncomfortable feeling. In the consciousness of her neighbors, that should Russia once begin to learn from Western Europe, she might become a dangerous factor in European politics. It was only as a military power which could be usefully employed against Turkey that Russia gradually became of importance to those of her Western neighbors who suffered from the wars and invasions of the Muslim power. In a letter sent to the Tsar by the Patriarch of Constantinople, these words occur. Russia slumbers while everyone else is in arms against Antichrist. All the pious Christians, Bulgars, Moldavians, and Wallachs are awaiting thy help. Sleep no longer. Arise and deliver us. Arise, 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 arise. Arise and deliver us. In 1676, a Venetian diplomatist calls attention to the fact that the Sultan had every reason to fear the Tsar of Muscovy, as the inhabitants of Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia, and Morea were of the same faith as the Russians and might at any moment be ready to throw off the Turkish yoke and go over to the Russian Tsar. The Orthodox Slavs of the Balkans did send a cry for help to the Orthodox Russians, but in those days Russia was unable, either as a military power or by diplomacy, to fulfill their expectations. Yet 10 years later, the siege of Vienna by the Turks caused the Allied powers, the Pope, the of Germany, the King of Poland, and the Republic of Venice to invite all other potentates, especially the two Tsars of Moscow, to join this Christian coalition. Join this Christian coalition against the Muslims. Go join this Christian coalition against the Muslims.